I stood on my own front porch holding a cardboard box of conference materials, and my key did not work. I tried it 3 times before I let myself believe what was happening. I turned it left, then right, then jiggled the handle the way you do when some small part of you is hoping the problem is mechanical rather than intentional. Through the front window, I could see movement inside. A lamp I did not recognize sitting on a side table that used to hold a photograph of my husband and me on our wedding day. New curtains where mine had been. Someone walking past the hallway carrying a stack of folded towels. I had been gone 4 days for a structural engineering conference in Denver. 4 days. I set the box down on the porch step and I stood there for a moment, looking at the house I had designed myself, down to the placement of every window, the house I had paid for with a down payment from savings I had built over a decade of careful work, the house that had my name and only my name on the deed. I did not knock, I did not call my husband Derek, though his car was visible in the driveway behind another car I recognized as his sister's. I took out my phone and I called my brother Marcus instead. He picked up on the second ring. I said calmly, "It's time." There was a brief pause on the other end and then he said, "I'll call David. Give me 20 minutes. David was my attorney. I had been paying him a small retainer for the past 6 months, ever since the day I first understood with absolute clarity that the house I had built might not stay mine unless I protected it properly. I sat down on the porch step beside my box and I waited. I was not panicking. I want you to understand that clearly because I think most people hearing this story expect the version where I am pounding on the door, where I am crying, where I am demanding answers from a husband who is not picking up his phone. That is not what happened. What happened is that I sat very calmly on my own porch step because I had been expecting this exact moment for 6 months, and I had already done everything necessary to make sure that when it finally came, I would be the only one who walked away from it standing on solid ground. My name is Olivia Bennett. I am 36 years old. I work as a structural engineer in Minneapolis, designing the bones of buildings that other people walk through every day without ever thinking about the calculations that keep the ceiling above their heads from falling in. I built my career from nothing, working through a state university on scholarships and part-time drafting jobs, and by the time I was 30 I had saved enough, through years of careful budgeting, to design and build a house entirely on my own terms. That house became the center of a conflict I never expected, with 2 women I never anticipated would try so deliberately to take it from me. This is the story of what happened, what I quietly did about it, and what eventually happened to the people who believed that patience and kindness meant the same thing as weakness. I designed the house myself. This matters to the story, so I want to explain it properly. I am not someone who hired an architect and picked finishes from a catalog. I drew the blueprints by hand before I ever brought them to a draftsman to formalize. I understood the load calculations, the foundation requirements, the way the morning light would move through the kitchen windows in winter because I had mapped the sun angles for our latitude before I finalized the window placement. It took me 4 years of saving, working extra structural consulting jobs on the side, before I had enough for the land and the down payment. I closed on the lot the same week I turned 31. I broke ground 8 months later. I met Derek the year the house was being framed. He was a marketing manager at a mid-sized company, easy to talk to, genuinely interested in what I did for work in a way that most people were not. He used to come by the construction site sometimes after work, bring me coffee, and listen while I explained why a particular beam needed reinforcing or why we had changed the roofline from the original plan. I liked that he asked questions. I liked that he seemed proud of what I was building in a way that felt supportive rather than competitive. We married 18 months after the house was finished. I want to be honest that I did consider at the time adding his name to the deed. It is a normal thing for a married couple to do. But something in me, some quiet practical instinct that had nothing to do with distrust of Derek specifically, made me hold off. I told him we would revisit it after a year of marriage once we both felt settled. He said that made sense. He did not push. I did not know yet that his mother would push for both of them. Carol, my mother-in-law, was a woman who had spent most of her adult life depending heavily on her children, particularly Derek, in ways that I initially read as simply close family bonds rather than what they actually were. She had been divorced from Derek's father for almost 15 years, lived alone in a small rental apartment across town, and called Derek several times a week about things that ranged from genuinely important to entirely trivial. The first 6 months of our marriage, Carol's presence in our lives was frequent but manageable. Sunday dinners, occasional weekday visits. I did not mind this. I liked the idea of being close to my husband's family since my own parents had passed years earlier and my only sibling Marcus lived 2 states away. The shift began the week Carol's apartment building announced renovations that would require tenants to relocate for 2 months. Derek asked if she could stay with us temporarily while she found a new place. I said yes, of course, assuming temporarily meant what the word generally means. Carol moved into our guest room with 4 suitcases and, I would later realize, very little actual intention of finding anywhere else to live. The 2 months stretched into 4, then 6. Every conversation about timeline ended with Derek telling me his mother just needed a little more time, that she was struggling emotionally with the divorce even all these years later, that I should be patient because family takes care of family. I was patient. What I did not fully account for was Whitney. Whitney, Derek's younger sister, lived across town with her own family, but once Carol settled into our guest room, Whitney's visits became increasingly frequent. At first it seemed natural. She was visiting her mother who happened to be staying with us. But the visits began extending beyond simply seeing Carol. Whitney started arriving with opinions about the house itself. She mentioned the first time that the kitchen would feel warmer with different paint. I said I liked the color I had chosen, a soft sage green I had spent weeks selecting to complement the natural light. 2 weeks later, I came home from work to find the kitchen a different color entirely. A pale yellow, applied without my knowledge or consent while I was at the office. When I asked Derek about it, he told me his mother and sister had been talking about how the kitchen felt a little cold, and they thought they would surprise me with something warmer. I was upset. I told him this was not their decision to make. He apologized, but in the particular way that men apologize when they are more interested in ending the conversation than actually understanding why something matters. I repainted the kitchen back to sage green myself the following weekend. Whitney commented when she saw it that I seemed very attached to controlling every detail of the house. I did not respond to that comment directly. I simply noted it the way I note small structural inconsistencies in a building inspection, filing it away as information rather than reacting to it in the moment. This became a pattern over the following months. Small intrusions. Small comments. Decisions made without me, framed afterward as thoughtful surprises rather than what they actually were, which was a slow, persistent erosion of my authority over my own home. I want to describe what happened next carefully, because I think this is the part of the story that people often recognize from their own lives, even if the specific details differ. Carol and Whitney did not attack me directly. That would have been easy to identify and easy to push back against. What they did instead was far more effective and far harder to name in the moment. They began talking to Derek about me when I was not present. I learned this gradually through small comments Derek would make that did not quite fit anything I had actually said or done. He would mention, almost offhand, that I seemed stressed lately, or that I had been short with him, or that maybe I needed to work on managing my temper better. I genuinely did not recognize myself in these descriptions. I am not a person prone to outbursts. I solve problems methodically, the same way I approach a structural calculation, and confrontation has never been my instinct. It took me several months to understand what was happening. Carol and Whitney were having private conversations with Derek, framing ordinary disagreements I had with them as evidence of instability or unreasonableness on my part. And Derek, hearing this narrative repeated consistently from 2 people he trusted, slowly began to internalize it as fact. One evening, after I had calmly asked Whitney to please check with me before rearranging furniture in the living room, Derek brought it up later that night, saying his mother and sister felt like I was becoming controlling and difficult to be around. I sat with that for a long moment. The accusation stung not because there was truth in it, but because of how completely it inverted what was actually happening. I asked Derek directly whether he believed that. He hesitated, which told me more than any answer he eventually gave. I began from that point forward to pay much closer attention, not in an anxious or reactive way. In the methodical way I approach every problem in my professional life. I started keeping a record. I want to take a moment here to explain something important about my profession because it shapes how I approached everything that followed. As a structural engineer, my entire career depends on documentation. Every calculation, every material specification, every inspection result has to be recorded precisely, because buildings fail when assumptions replace verification. I applied that same principle to my own life once I recognized what was happening. I began writing down dates and details of incidents, not out of paranoia, but out of the same instinct that makes me double-check a load-bearing calculation before signing off on it. If something was true, documentation would simply confirm it. If something was not true, documentation would reveal that too. Over the following months, the record grew, the kitchen repainting without consent. Specific comments Whitney made that Derek later repeated back to me, distorted, as evidence of my supposed difficulty. The gradual extension of Carol's stay from 2 months into what was now approaching a year, with no actual housing search that I could identify. I also did something else during this time, something I had not yet told Derek. I consulted an attorney. I want to be clear that this was not because I had decided to end my marriage. At that point, I still believed Derek and I could work through this, if I could simply find a way to make him see clearly what was happening. I consulted David, the attorney, primarily to understand my legal standing regarding the house, since I had begun to sense, in some instinctive way I could not yet fully articulate, that the house itself might become a point of conflict. David confirmed what I already suspected from my own research. Because the house had been built and purchased entirely with my own funds before our marriage, and because Derek had never been added to the deed, the property remained solely mine under state law, regardless of our marital status, unless I took deliberate action to change that. I asked David what would happen if Derek attempted to claim any interest in the house through other means, such as changing locks or attempting to establish residency claims through extended family occupation. David explained the relevant protections clearly and recommended I begin keeping thorough documentation of who lived in the house, for how long, and under what arrangement. I had already been doing exactly that. I retained David on a small monthly basis after that conversation. Not because I expected things to escalate to where they eventually did, but because, as an engineer, I have learned that the cost of preparation is always smaller than the cost of being caught without it. The work conference in Denver had been scheduled for almost a year. It was an important professional event, the kind of gathering where I would present research I had been developing on seismic reinforcement techniques, work that mattered significantly to my career trajectory. I told Derek about the dates months in advance. He seemed supportive at the time, though looking back, I noticed a particular quality to his support that I had not registered fully until later. He asked unusually specific questions about exactly how long I would be gone and whether I would have reliable phone service throughout. I did not think much of it then. The week before I left, the household dynamic felt different in a way I struggled to name. Carol and Whitney were both unusually present, having what seemed like constant quiet conversations with Derek that stopped whenever I entered the room. I asked Derek directly if something was going on. He told me everything was fine, that his mother was just dealing with some stress about her living situation, and that I should not worry about it while I was preparing for my presentation. I left for Denver on a Tuesday morning. The conference ran 4 days. I called Derek each evening. The first 2 calls were brief but normal. By the third evening, his responses had become shorter, slightly evasive in a way I noticed but attributed generously to him simply being tired or distracted. On the 4th day, my final morning in Denver, I tried calling him before my flight and received no answer. I tried again that afternoon between sessions. No answer. I did not panic. I assumed reasonably that he was busy with work. I landed back in Minneapolis around 6 in the evening, took a rideshare home, and walked up to my own front door with my conference bag and a box of printed materials. My key did not turn the lock. I have already told you what happened next. The lamp I did not recognize, the new curtains, my brother on the phone, the calm, deliberate decision to wait rather than confront. What I had not told you yet is what happened in the 20 minutes while I waited for David to arrive. Derek eventually came to the door, having apparently been alerted by his sister that I was sitting on the porch. He opened it partway, looking uncomfortable in a way that told me he understood on some level that what had happened was not easily defensible. He told me that his mother and sister had been concerned about my mental state lately, that they felt I had become increasingly controlling and unstable, and that they thought it would be best for everyone if I had some space to, in his words, work through whatever I was dealing with. I asked him calmly who had decided to change the locks. He said it had been a family decision made together to protect everyone's well-being during a difficult time. I asked him whose name was on the deed to the house. He paused. I could see in that pause the moment where something he had perhaps not fully considered suddenly became very relevant to him. I told him, still calmly, that David, my attorney, would be arriving shortly, and that I would be staying with my brother that evening, but that I expected the locks to be restored to their original state, and the house returned to its proper condition within 48 hours. Derek started to say something about how this all seemed extreme. I told him that changing the locks on a house solely owned by your spouse without her knowledge or consent while she was traveling for work was the extreme action in this situation, not my response to it. David arrived 10 minutes later. Marcus arrived shortly after. What followed was not a screaming confrontation. It was, in many ways, more uncomfortable for everyone involved precisely because of how calm and procedural it was. David explained, clearly and without dramatics, the legal reality of the situation to everyone present, including Carol and Whitney, who had come to the door once they realized I was not simply going to leave quietly. The house belonged solely to me. Derek had no legal ownership interest in the property. Changing the locks on a homeowner's residence without her consent, regardless of marital status, constituted an unlawful exclusion, and David made clear that we were prepared to pursue whatever legal remedies were necessary if the situation was not resolved immediately. Carol attempted to argue that she had been living there for nearly a year and had certain rights as a result. David explained, patiently but firmly, that informal extended stays as a guest did not establish any legal tenancy rights, particularly given that her residency had never been formalized through any lease agreement or other legal arrangement. I watched Whitney's expression shift during this conversation. I think, for the first time, she was beginning to understand that the narrative she and Carol had constructed about me, the framing of me as the unreasonable, controlling one, did not actually hold up against the simple legal facts of the situation. Derek stood somewhat apart from his mother and sister during this conversation, and I noticed something in his posture that I had not seen in months. A kind of distance from them, as though some part of him was finally recognizing the position he had allowed himself to be put in. The locks were changed back that same evening, with David present to ensure it was done properly. Carol and Whitney left, taking with them the belongings that had accumulated over the better part of a year. I did not gloat. I want to be honest about that. There was no satisfaction in watching two people pack boxes in tense silence. There was only a tired, hollow kind of relief, the feeling of finally setting down something heavy that I had been carrying for far too long. The weeks following that night were not simple. Derek and I attempted, initially, to work through what had happened. He apologized repeatedly for allowing his mother and sister's narrative to shape his perception of me for so long. He acknowledged that he had not adequately questioned why Carol's temporary stay had stretched into nearly a year, or why he had agreed to something as significant as changing the locks based on conversations I had never been part of. I wanted to believe the apology meant a genuine shift in understanding. For a period of several weeks it seemed like it might, but certain patterns are difficult to fully unwind, even with good intentions. Carol continued calling Derek frequently, and I noticed, even after everything that had happened, a familiar reluctance in him to set clear boundaries with her. Whitney sent me one message, weeks later, that read less like an apology and more like an attempt to reframe what had happened as a misunderstanding rather than what it actually was. I did not respond. I want to share what happened to Carol and Whitney in the months that followed, not because I take satisfaction in their hardship, but because I think it illustrates something important about the situation they had created. Carol, it turned out, had been relying almost entirely on the free housing our home had provided for nearly a year. She had not, despite what she told Derek, been actively searching for alternative housing during that time. Once she was required to find her own place again, she discovered that her financial situation, which had been quietly subsidized by not paying rent for almost 12 months, was far more precarious than she had allowed herself to acknowledge. She moved into a small apartment considerably less comfortable than the one she had originally been displaced from, and Derek, despite everything, found himself once again financially supporting her in ways that strained our own household budget. Whitney's situation shifted as well, though more gradually. Her husband, who had grown increasingly frustrated over the months with how much time and energy Whitney devoted to managing conflicts in Derek's household rather than her own family, eventually raised concerns that led to significant tension in her own marriage. I learned, secondhand through Derek, that Whitney and her husband attended counseling for several months to address what he described as her tendency to insert herself excessively into other people's households at the expense of her own. I do not share this with any particular satisfaction. I share it because I think it illustrates something I came to understand clearly during this entire experience. Carol and Whitney had spent so much energy trying to control and reshape my household that neither of them had adequately attended to the well-being of their own lives. The house they had tried to claim a stake in was never actually the point. The control itself had become the point, and when that control was removed, what remained underneath it was considerably less stable than either of them had allowed themselves to recognize. Derek and I separated 4 months after the incident with the locked door. I want to be honest that this was not entirely about Carol and Whitney, though their influence had certainly damaged something significant in our marriage. It became clear over those 4 months that Derek struggled fundamentally with setting boundaries, not just with his mother and sister, but in general, and that this pattern was unlikely to change in any meaningful way without considerably more work than either of us, at that point, was prepared to do. We separated without significant conflict, in large part because the legal reality of the house had already been clearly established. There was no battle over property, no drawn-out dispute about who would keep what. I kept the house I had built because it had always, legally and practically, been mine. I think in many ways this made the separation cleaner than it might otherwise have been. Derek moved out over a single weekend. We divided the rest of our shared possessions amicably. There was sadness in it, certainly, the particular grief that comes from watching something you had hoped would last simply not work out the way you had planned. But there was also, underneath that sadness, a quiet sense of clarity that I had not felt in over a year. I still live in the house I designed. I repainted the kitchen back to sage green, the color I had originally chosen, the week after Derek moved out. It felt important somehow to restore that small detail to exactly what I had wanted it to be from the beginning. I think often about what this entire experience taught me, and I want to share the parts of it that I believe matter most. The first is that documentation and preparation are not signs of distrust or pessimism. They are simply responsible practice, the same way a careful engineer verifies calculations rather than assuming they are correct. I did not consult an attorney because I expected my marriage to fail. I consulted an attorney because I understood instinctively that protecting what I had built was a reasonable thing to do, regardless of how things eventually turned out. The second is that boundaries, when they are violated gradually and incrementally, can be very difficult to recognize in the moment. Carol and Whitney did not attack me directly. They eroded my standing slowly, through small comments and small decisions made without my input, until those small things accumulated into something significant. I think this pattern is more common than people realize, and I think recognizing it early, the way I eventually did through careful documentation, matters enormously. The third thing I learned is harder to articulate, but I think it is the most important. Karma, if that is even the right word for it, rarely arrives as a dramatic, satisfying reckoning. It arrived for Carol and Whitney quietly, through the slow unraveling of situations they had built on assumptions that were never actually solid. Carol's housing instability, Whitney's marital strain. These were not things I orchestrated or wished upon them. They were simply the natural consequence of two people who had spent so much energy trying to control someone else's life that they had neglected the stability of their own. I do not know exactly what the future holds. I am 37 now, living alone in a house that still, after everything, feels entirely like mine in the way it was always meant to. What I know for certain is this. I built something with my own hands and my own careful planning, and when people tried to take it from me, the foundation I had laid, both literally and legally, held exactly the way I had designed it to. That, I think, is the most honest lesson I can offer. Build carefully, document thoroughly, And never assume that kindness toward others means you are obligated to remain quiet about protecting what is rightfully yours. The locks on my door work properly now. They always did, technically. I simply made sure long before I ever needed to that I was the only one who could decide who held the key. If this story resonated with you, share it with someone who has had to quietly protect what they built. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is prepare carefully and wait calmly for the truth to become undeniable on its own.